What if the greatest threat to America's future isn't a war, a recession, or even inflation? What if the real danger has been quietly growing for decades while most Americans barely notice it? Right now, the United States is carrying a debt burden so enormous that the numbers hardly seem real anymore. Every day, billions of dollars are added to the national debt, and every year, the cost of paying interest continues to rise. Most people assume America can keep borrowing forever because it always has. But according to billionaire investor Ray Dalio, that assumption could be one of the biggest mistakes of our time. He believes the United States may be entering the final stage of a debt cycle that has been building for generations. And if history is any guide, the consequences could affect everything from the economy and the dollar to jobs, savings, and the financial future of ordinary Americans. The most surprising part is that debt crises rarely begin with panic. They begin with confidence. People believe everything is under control, right up until the moment it isn't. That's why Dalio's warning deserves attention, not because he is predicting an immediate collapse, but because he believes the warning signs are becoming too large to ignore. The question is no longer whether America has a debt problem. The question is how long it can continue before the system reaches a breaking point. To understand why Ray Dalio is concerned, we first need to understand how debt works. Debt itself is not necessarily bad. In fact, debt can help economies grow. Businesses borrow money to expand. Families borrow money to buy homes. Governments borrow money to invest in infrastructure and respond to emergencies. Problems begin when debt grows much faster than income. Imagine a family whose expenses keep increasing every year, while their income barely changes. At first, they use credit cards to cover the difference. Then they take out loans. For a while, everything seems fine because the bills are still getting paid. But eventually the debt becomes so large that simply making interest payments becomes a challenge. Nations face the same reality. The United States has spent decades borrowing money to fund programs, support economic growth, and navigate crises. As long as investors remained confident and interest rates stayed low, the system worked. But now the debt is reaching levels that many experts consider unsustainable, and the cost of maintaining the debt is rising rapidly. One of the biggest concerns is the government's growing interest payments. Most Americans don't think about interest costs when they hear discussions about the national debt. Yet those costs may be one of the most important parts of the story. Every dollar spent paying interest is a dollar that cannot be used for roads, schools, healthcare, defense, or other priorities. As debt increases, interest expenses increase alongside it. This creates a dangerous cycle. The government borrows more money, which leads to higher interest payments, which then require even more borrowing. Over time, this cycle becomes increasingly difficult to control. Ray Dalio has repeatedly warned that when debt servicing costs begin growing faster than government revenue, policymakers face difficult choices. They can cut spending, raise taxes, print money, or continue borrowing. None of these options are easy, and each comes with significant consequences. What makes the current situation especially unusual is that America is running massive deficits even during periods when the economy is relatively strong. Historically, governments would often spend heavily during recessions and then reduce deficits when economic conditions improved. Today, that pattern appears to be changing. Even without a major economic crisis, deficits remain enormous. This suggests that the debt problem is becoming structural rather than temporary. In other words, the issue is no longer simply responding to emergencies. The government is spending significantly more than it collects year after year, creating a long-term imbalance that becomes harder to solve over time. Ray Dalio often points to history when discussing debt cycles. Throughout history, many powerful nations reached periods where debt grew faster than their economies. At first, the problem seemed manageable. investors remained confident, governments continued borrowing, and economic activity continued, but eventually reality caught up. In some cases, countries experienced inflation. In others, currencies weakened. Some faced years of slow growth, while others encountered severe financial instability. The details differed from country to country, but the pattern remained remarkably similar. Excessive debt eventually forced difficult adjustments. Dalio believes the United States is not exempt from these historical patterns simply because it is America. While the country remains incredibly powerful, financial mathematics apply to every nation. Another reason for concern is the changing role of the U.S. dollar in the global economy. For decades, the dollar has served as the world's reserve currency. Countries around the world hold dollars, conduct trade using dollars, and purchase U.S. Treasury securities because they are viewed as safe assets. This global demand has allowed the United States to borrow at lower costs than many other countries. However, the world is changing. Geopolitical tensions are increasing. New economic alliances are emerging. Some countries are actively searching for alternatives to reduce their dependence on the dollar. While the dollar remains dominant today, Ray Dalio argues that reserve currency status should never be viewed as permanent. History shows that financial leadership eventually shifts, often much more gradually than people expect, until one day the change becomes impossible to ignore. Inflation adds another layer of complexity. When governments face large debt burdens, they sometimes rely on money creation to ease financial pressures. While this strategy can provide short-term relief, it often comes at the cost of inflation. Americans experienced firsthand how painful inflation can be. Grocery bills increased, housing costs surged, everyday necessities became more expensive. Even though inflation has moderated from its peak levels, many economists believe the underlying risks remain. If debt pressures continue building, policymakers could once again face difficult choices that affect the value of money and the purchasing power of American households. Perhaps the most important part of Ray Dalio's warning is that debt crises rarely happen overnight. Most people imagine dramatic crashs appearing suddenly without warning. In reality, major financial shifts often unfold slowly and then accelerate unexpectedly. Investors begin questioning long-term sustainability. Borrowing costs rise. Economic growth slows. Government budgets become increasingly constrained. Confidence gradually weakens. Then what seemed manageable for years suddenly becomes a major problem. This is why Dalio focuses less on predicting exact dates and more on identifying long-term trends. He believes the trend itself is what should concern Americans. For ordinary families, these issues may seem distant, but they have real-world consequences. Higher debt levels can influence mortgage rates, car loans, credit card interest, retirement savings, investment returns, and employment opportunities. Economic challenges at the national level eventually filter down to households. People may notice higher living costs, slower wage growth, reduced opportunities, or greater financial uncertainty. Even those who never follow economic news can feel the effects when debt-related pressures begin impacting everyday life. Despite these warnings, it is important to understand that Ray Dalio is not saying America is doomed. The United States remains one of the most innovative and productive economies in the world. It has overcome major challenges before and possesses significant strengths that many countries lack. The real issue is whether leaders are willing to address long-term problems before they become far more difficult to solve. History shows that early action is almost always less painful than waiting until a crisis forces change. The longer debt continues growing unchecked, the fewer options remain available. As America moves deeper into this decade, the debate surrounding debt is likely to become even more important. Some believe economic growth and technological innovation will help reduce the burden. Others argue that major reforms are necessary to avoid serious consequences, regardless of which side ultimately proves correct. One fact is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Debt is no longer a distant issue for economists and policymakers. It is becoming one of the defining challenges of America's future, and according to Ray Dalio, the warning signs suggest that the country may already be entering the final stage of a debt cycle that has been building for generations. The decisions made in the coming years could determine whether America successfully navigates this challenge or whether the debt crisis eventually reshapes the economic future of the nation.